There's a particular kind of silence that follows devastation, not the peaceful kind, but the type where you sit in your room at 3 a.m. staring at nothing while feeling everything. The world outside continues with cars passing and someone laughing in the distance as life persists. But inside you, something has fundamentally changed. You've crossed into a territory you didn't choose, and there's no map for the journey back. Or perhaps more truthfully, there is no journey back, but only through. You know this feeling. Maybe it came after a loss that hollowed you out, or maybe it arrived through betrayal or failure, or the slow erosion of who you thought you were. Maybe it was sudden with a phone call, or a diagnosis, or a moment where the floor simply disappeared beneath you. And however it came, it brought you to this strange liminal space where you're neither who you were nor who you'll become. You're suspended in the transformation, and it feels less like growth and more like disintegration. Here's what nobody tells you when you're in that space. Your suffering isn't random noise in an otherwise meaningful life, and it isn't something to simply survive and move past. There's a peculiar alchemy happening in those dark hours, something ancient and psychological that humans have known for millennia but struggle to articulate. Your pain is doing something by rewiring you and restructuring the very architecture of how you perceive reality, yourself, and other people. While that process feels like dying, and in many ways it is, it's also the only pathway to a kind of aliveness you couldn't access before. This isn't about positive thinking or finding silver linings, or pretending your suffering serves some cosmic purpose. It's more subtle than that, and more honest, because the truth is that suffering doesn't make sense when you're inside it. It's senseless and brutal, and deeply unfair. But somehow, in ways that psychology is only beginning to understand, the human psyche has this strange capacity to not just survive devastation, but to be fundamentally transformed by it. To become more than you were, not despite the suffering, but through it. You've probably noticed this in others, how the people with the most depth and the most genuine compassion and the most nuanced understanding of what it means to be human are often the ones who've been broken open by life. There's something in their eyes, a kind of knowing that isn't wisdom in the guru sense, but a quiet recognition of what lies beneath the surface of things. They've seen the underworld and sat with their demons, and somehow they've brought something back with them. But when it's you in that darkness, this knowledge doesn't comfort. You don't want transformation but relief. You want the pain to stop, and you want to go back to the person you were before everything fell apart. And here's where the paradox deepens. That very desire to return, or to undo, or to escape is what keeps you trapped. Because healing through suffering doesn't mean the suffering ends, but rather that you stop running from it. You turn toward it, and you let it teach you its terrible, necessary lessons. This is the journey we're about to explore together. Not the version where suffering is noble or beautiful because it isn't, but the version where it's real and where it's yours, and where hidden within its depths is a pathway to a kind of healing that doesn't erase what happened, but transforms what it means. Your brain wasn't designed for happiness, and that might sound bleak, but stay with it, because your brain was designed for survival and for adaptation and for navigating a world that's unpredictable and often dangerous. And here's what's remarkable. The same neural mechanisms that help you survive threat are the ones that enable profound psychological transformation. When you suffer, your brain doesn't just register pain, but reorganizes itself around that pain while seeking patterns and meaning and new ways of understanding what happened and who you are in relation to it. Neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself based on experience. But what they're really describing is something more profound, in that your consciousness is malleable. Suffering creates what psychologists call optimal conditions for growth, which sounds almost cruel when you're in the depths of it, yet there's truth here. When your existing frameworks for understanding life collapse, and when the story you've been telling yourself about who you are and how the world works suddenly doesn't hold, your psyche is forced into a state of openness. Not the comfortable kind, but the terrifying kind. The kind where everything is uncertain and where meaning itself becomes fluid. In that fluid state, something extraordinary becomes possible. Psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun studied thousands of people who'd experienced severe trauma, including loss of loved ones and life-threatening illness and violence and disasters. And what they found challenges our assumptions about how trauma works. Yes, many people experienced lasting distress, but a significant number reported something else which they called post-traumatic growth, and it manifests in specific measurable ways. People report deeper relationships and greater appreciation for life and recognition of new possibilities, and a sense of personal strength they didn't know they possessed, and often a richer spiritual or existential understanding. This isn't about trauma being worth it, because that's not the point. The point is that the human psyche, when shattered, doesn't always just put itself back together in the same configuration, and sometimes it builds something new, something that incorporates the fracture lines. And that's actually stronger in its brokenness because it's more honest and more flexible and more real. Viktor Frankl understood this in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. As a psychiatrist surviving Nazi concentration camps, he observed that the prisoners who found ways to create meaning from their suffering, even tiny private meanings, were more likely to survive psychologically intact. He noticed that suffering itself is inevitable, but the meaning we make from it isn't, and that meaning-making is where our freedom lives. Even in the most constrained circumstances, we retain the capacity to choose how we hold our pain and what story we tell about it and what it teaches us about being human. This is where suffering becomes a threshold rather than an ending. Your brain is literally searching for coherence and for narrative and for ways to integrate this devastating experience into your sense of self. And depending on how you engage with that process, whether you resist it or numb it, or avoid it, or slowly painfully turn toward it, you're shaping what emerges on the other side. There's a particular quality to suffering that forces confrontation with fundamental questions. When everything is stripped away, including your illusions and your defenses, and your carefully constructed identity, what remains? Who are you when you're not who you thought you were? And what matters when everything you thought mattered is gone? These aren't philosophical abstractions, but lived questions that suffering demands you answer. And in answering them, you're not just processing pain, but reconstructing your entire relationship to existence. The research on resilience reveals something similar, in that resilience isn't something you have or don't have, but something that develops through adversity. Each time you face something difficult and find a way through, not around or over but through, you're building psychological flexibility. You're learning at a cellular level that you can break and not be destroyed, that you can feel what seems unsurvivable and survive it, and that your capacity is larger than you imagined. But here's what the science also tells us. This growth isn't automatic. Suffering alone doesn't transform you, since plenty of people experience trauma and become more rigid and more defended and more closed off, and the difference lies in what you do with the suffering. Whether you give yourself permission to feel it fully, whether you find ways to articulate it and to integrate it and to let it reshape you rather than define you, and whether you can sit in the uncertainty long enough for new meanings to emerge. Your nervous system is recording everything, including the moments you allow yourself to cry and the moments you reach out for connection instead of isolating, and the moments you acknowledge the truth of your pain rather than minimizing it. Each of these moments is a tiny act of integration that teaches your brain that this experience, as terrible as it is, can be held and can be metabolized and can become part of your story without becoming the whole story. And slowly, so slowly you might not notice, the suffering begins to change texture. It doesn't disappear, but it starts to coexist with other things, like moments of unexpected beauty and deeper connections, and a strange, hard-won appreciation for the fragility and preciousness of being alive. The pain becomes a companion rather than an invader, and a teacher rather than a tormentor. This is the science of healing through suffering, not a formula or a guarantee, but a map of what becomes possible when you stop fighting the transformation and start participating in it. The first stage of this journey is the one nobody wants, which is acknowledgement. Not acceptance, because that comes much later, if at all, but just acknowledgement that this happened, and this is happening, and I am in pain. It sounds simple, but your entire psychological system is designed to protect you from this admission, because once you acknowledge it, you have to feel it. And feeling it is exactly what you've been trying not to do. You've developed sophisticated ways to avoid this moment by staying busy, or intellectualizing, or telling yourself it could be worse, or comparing your pain to others and deciding yours doesn't count. Pushing it down and scheduling it for later, and promising yourself you'll deal with it when things calm down. But things don't calm down. The pain doesn't wait politely, as it seeps into everything, including your sleep and your relationships and the way food tastes, and the way sunlight looks. It's already here. An acknowledgement is just finally admitting what your body already knows. When you stop running even for a moment, you encounter the actual texture of your suffering, and it's not what you expected. It's not a single emotion, but layered, where beneath the obvious grief might be rage, and beneath the rage might be fear, and beneath the fear might be a profound aching loneliness. Or maybe it moves differently for you with shame, then numbness, then a crushing sense of meaninglessness. And every person's topography of pain is unique. But what's universal is this: you have to map it, and you have to sit with each layer and feel its particular quality and let it move through you. This sitting with pain is where most people get stuck, because sitting with it doesn't mean wallowing or making it your identity or letting it consume your life. It means something more paradoxical, in that you create space for the pain while also creating space around the pain. And you let yourself feel devastated while also remembering that devastation isn't all you are. You hold both truths simultaneously, and this is exhausting, which is why healing isn't linear. Some days you can do this, and some days you can't. And some days you regress into denial, or rage, or despair. But this isn't failure. This is the actual process. What you're learning in these moments, though it doesn't feel like learning, is tolerance. Not tolerance in the sense of endurance, but in the psychological sense, where you're expanding your capacity to be with difficult experiences without fragmenting. Every time you feel something unbearable and don't run, you're teaching your nervous system that we can feel this, it's terrible, but we can feel it. And gradually, imperceptibly, that window widens, and things that would have shattered you a month ago, you can now hold. Not easily, but you can hold them. There's a difference between suffering that destroys and suffering that transforms, and the difference is surprisingly subtle. Destructive suffering happens in isolation, when you're convinced you're alone with this pain and that no one could understand and that reaching out would be burdensome or futile. When the pain becomes your entire identity, not something you're experiencing, but something you are, and when you lose all sense of agency and all belief that anything could ever change. This is when suffering calcifies, and when it becomes trauma that freezes you rather than pain that moves through you. Transformative suffering happens in relationship, not necessarily with other people, though connection helps profoundly, but relationship with the suffering itself. You develop a different stance toward it where, instead of seeing it as an enemy to defeat or a poison to purge you, start to see it as information, as communication from the deepest parts of yourself, and your suffering is trying to tell you something about what you needed and didn't get, and about what you've been denying, and about what's asking to be released or honoured or grieved. And you develop relationship with yourself as the person experiencing this, which might sound strange, but in the midst of suffering, it's common to abandon yourself, to become harsh and critical, and to judge yourself for struggling, and to compare yourself to some imagined version of who you should be, and coming back to yourself with gentleness, with the same compassion you'd offer someone you love who's in pain. This is part of the transformation. You practice speaking to yourself differently, not with false positivity, but with truthfulness and tenderness. This is so hard, and you're doing the best you can, and it's okay to not be okay. As you move through these stages of acknowledging and feeling and sitting with and relating to your suffering differently, something begins to shift. Not suddenly and not dramatically, but you start to notice small things, like a moment where you felt present despite the pain, or a conversation that actually touched you, or a morning where you woke up and the weight was fractionally lighter. These moments don't mean the suffering is over, but that you're integrating it and you're learning to carry it differently. This is where meaning-making begins. Not imposed meaning, or not convincing yourself this happened for a reason, in some cosmic sense, but discovered meaning. You start to notice what this experience has revealed, and maybe it's shown you who truly shows up. Or maybe it's clarified what matters and what doesn't. Maybe it's stripped away pretense and forced you into a more honest way of living. Or maybe it's connected you to your own fragility and through that to everyone else's fragility. Maybe it's given you access to depths of feeling you'd never touched before, depths that include pain, but also include awe and tenderness and gratitude for small things. The meaning emerges slowly and organically, like a photograph developing in solution. You don't create it through willpower, but discover it through attention, through staying present to your experience, instead of rushing past it, and through asking not why did this happen, but what is this teaching me about being human? There's a version of you that could only exist on the other side of this suffering. Not a better version or a fixed version, but a more complete version. Someone who knows things that can't be learned any other way, and someone who's been to the edge of what they thought they could survive, and discovered they're larger than they knew. You can feel this person emerging even if you can't quite see them. Yet, they're more honest than you were before. Not brutally honest, but gently honest in a way that comes from having nothing left to hide. When you've been broken open, pretense becomes too exhausting to maintain, and you start saying what you actually mean, and you start asking for what you actually need. You stop performing versions of yourself designed to make others comfortable. Not because you've become reckless or selfish, but because you've learned the cost of inauthenticity. And after what you've been through, that cost is too high. This person relates to others differently, since suffering has given you X-ray vision for pain. You can see it in people now even when they're smiling, and you recognize the particular way someone holds their body when they're barely keeping it together. You notice the tremor in someone's voice when they say they're fine. And instead of looking away the way people probably looked away from you when your pain was too visible, you offer something. Maybe just acknowledgement, or a moment of genuine seeing, or permission to not be okay. And this isn't because you've become some enlightened being, but because you remember what it felt like to be unseen in your suffering. And you've decided that matters. Your relationships either deepen or end during this transformation, since some people can't meet you in this new depth. They want the old you back, the lighter, easier version, and you might grieve this. But you also recognize that the relationships that remain and that grow stronger through your suffering are the ones built on something real, and people who can sit with you in the dark without trying to fix you or rush you into the light. People who love you not despite your brokenness, but inclusive of it. And these relationships become sacred in a way you couldn't have understood before. You develop a different relationship with time where suffering slows everything down and forces you into the present moment, because that's the only thing you can actually survive. This moment and this breath. And even after the acute pain passes, this quality of presence often remains, and you notice things you would have missed before. The specific quality of morning light and the way your child's hand feels in yours, and the taste of coffee and the sound of rain, not because these things are more intense, but because you are. You've been scrubbed raw by pain, and that rawness makes you more sensitive to everything, including beauty and connection, and the extraordinary fact of being alive at all. There's a particular kind of strength that emerges from having survived what you thought would destroy you. Not the strength of invulnerability, since you know now that you're deeply vulnerable, and that life can shatter you at any moment, but the strength of knowing you can be shattered and still exist, still have value and still be worthy of love and connection and joy. And this is a paradoxical strength that includes fragility rather than denying it. And it makes you both more tender and more resilient than you were before. You might notice you're less afraid, not of pain since you know what pain is now and it's terrifying, but less afraid of the smaller anxieties that used to consume you. What people think, and whether you're succeeding according to some external measure, and whether you're doing life right. And these concerns don't disappear entirely, but they have less power. You've faced something much scarier, and you've survived your own underworld journey. And the everyday fears shrink in comparison. Sometimes you'll touch something that feels almost like gratitude, not for the suffering itself, since you'd undo it if you could, but for what came with it. For the person you've become, and for the wisdom you carry, and for the way your heart has expanded to include more complexity and more nuance and more truth. And this gratitude feels strange and almost guilty. How can you be grateful for something that hurt so much, but it's not gratitude for the pain? It's gratitude for your own resilience and for the human capacity to transform poison into medicine, and for the fact that you're still here, and still feeling, and still becoming. You realize that healing doesn't mean returning to who you were since that person is gone. They had to die for this new person to emerge. And while you might mourn them with the innocence and the lightness and the uncomplicated joy that they had access to, you also recognize that this new person has access to something else, a depth and a realness and a connection to the fundamental mystery of being human that you couldn't reach before. This is what psychologists mean when they talk about post-traumatic growth. Not that trauma is good or that you should be grateful for it, but that the human psyche has this remarkable, almost miraculous capacity to take what breaks us and build something new from the pieces, to let the cracks become places where light gets in, and to use the suffering as material for transformation rather than just damage to repair. You're not the same and you'll never be the same, but maybe, just maybe, you're something more honest and more compassionate and more alive to the preciousness and fragility of this brief, beautiful, painful experience of being human. And perhaps that's what healing through suffering really means. Not that the pain was worth it, or that it served some grand purpose, but that you survived it. You met it and you let it break you open. And in that breaking, you discovered depths you didn't know you contained. You became acquainted with your own vastness and you learned that you're strong enough to be broken and still whole, wounded and still sacred, forever changed and somehow against all odds still becoming. This is who you were meant to be, not despite what you've suffered, but having suffered it. Having walked through that fire and brought back something precious from the flames, your own hard-won wisdom and your own fierce tenderness, and your own proof that the human heart can break and break and break, and still miraculously remain capable of love.